Welcome to the Sanctions Age, the podcast that explores how sanctions are changing the world. My name is Isfandir Batmanghelidj. Today's show is about how global CEOs are navigating the sanctions landscape. In recent decades, multinational companies have pursued market opportunities around the world, creating complex supply chains and financial structures in the process. But what was once a world of expanding opportunity is increasingly a world of encroaching risks. With sanctions and export controls imposed on a growing list of countries, including major economies like Iran and Russia, multinational companies have had to scale back or even exit markets. Now, CEOs are wondering where sanctions might hit next and how they can shield their businesses from emerging risks. My guest today is helping global executives work through their anxieties. Henry Smith is partner at Control Risks, where he leads the company's business intelligence and due diligence practice in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Henry advises global companies on how to adjust acquisition and growth strategies in the face of a changing sanctions landscape. Henry, thanks for coming onto the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Isfandir.
Henry, saying that CEOs need to navigate the sanctions landscape is a bit abstract. So let's try and make things more concrete. Let's imagine that you are the CEO of a major multinational company with manufacturing operations across multiple continents, and let's say your headquarters is in Europe. How often are you thinking about the sanctions landscape, and what does that really entail? What are you trying to navigate?
There's a framing point which I think can often be missed by senior business leaders when they think about sanctions. And that framing point is that sanctions are a foreign policy tool used by governments to achieve foreign policy objectives that are typically counter to a European CEO's business interests. Business people have increasingly had to plan for and manage the conflict between foreign policy and national security on the one hand, and more traditional neoliberal capitalist business models that they've pursued on the other hand. And that's a broader discussion than just sanctions. There are other regulatory developments that demonstrate that at the moment. However, when we talk about CEOs navigating sanctions, then we have to understand this frame, I think. Your business interests are ultimately secondary to those foreign policy objectives. And I think CEOs struggle to understand that at times. Or if they understand it, they don't particularly like it. Moreover, in the example of the European manufacturing company, which I've just been promoted to being CEO of, those foreign policy objectives may not be European foreign policy objectives, or those of the EU or the EU member state in which that company is headquartered. It's possible that those are objectives of other governments, most notably in the past 10 years or so, those of the US, which I imagine we'll come on to later. So having established this framing question, I think we can then talk about the various intended and unintended consequences of sanctions that CEOs and other senior executives need to navigate. And these are things like having to terminate business relationships and contracts as sanctions evolve and move, spend more money on risk and compliance processes and expertise in your supply chains, but also in your sales and business development processes, and engagement with shareholders and investors, lenders and banks, regulators and government agencies, and often employees as well, who are put in very difficult and sensitive positions as a result of sanctions. So all these things come together in different ways, and I think the complexity of them and the extent to which any given business leader is thinking about them is going to be quite contingent on what that company does, where it does it, and the scale and sophistication of that organization.
So, at the top, I was sort of making a joke that CEOs probably face some anxiety given all of this complexity, but it sounds like it is a potentially very frustrating and difficult position to be in, especially with so many stakeholders that the CEO is responsible to. And I guess the question then becomes, how exactly are CEOs trying to then make the right decision in that environment? You have a very complex landscape. You have challenges that touch on many different parts of a multinational business. So CEOs are having to grapple with that responsibility. And who exactly are they getting to help them make these decisions? I mean, internally, what teams are they dependent on? Do they have external advisors? And, what is it really that's at stake for a CEO to make sure that they get the right information and are able to then make the right decision in this complex environment?
So I will caveat this from the start with it depends. And it depends ultimately on the sector that a business is in, its size and its geographical complexity. And those things really come together in different ways, I think, to dictate how much attention and time this issue gets in senior leadership teams, but also how they think about it. Now, the role of a CEO, in very simplistic terms, is to set the strategic direction of an organization and to be a custodian for the successful delivery of that company's corporate objectives and its management of risk for different stakeholders. So to do that effectively, when you're thinking narrowly about sanctions, I think senior leaders need to be able to look ahead geopolitically. They need to be able to understand potential areas of conflict in foreign policy positions of governments. And they need to be thinking about the regulatory innovations that governments are considering themselves to try and achieve these foreign policy goals. And to go back to the earlier framing point, one thing I think is a good way for senior leaders to think about sanctions is to say, is ultimately what I'm trying to do consistent with the foreign policy objectives of this government? Because if it isn't, you're inevitably going to hit some sort of rub. If it is, then the chances of friction are, I think, far more reduced. And then we will talk about that a bit more, I suspect, later with regards to Russia. Now, to be able to do all of that, you need people around you, and they can be your colleagues, they can be external advisors of various types, who understand politics and think politically and can apply their political thinking to business decisions. And where I've seen things go wrong is the conversations about politics happen in one part of an organization, say in a government affairs team, but is maybe a little isolated from other divisions such as the legal and compliance team in our client. And they sort of talk past each other because they're used to talking to different audiences about different themes. And if there has been any change in how some of our clients are considering politics, sanctions, and other regulatory developments linked to politics, it has been how they institutionally integrate that thinking a little more.
So there's more basically integration happening between functions that were previously separate because sanctions necessarily are something advanced because of political aims, but they're a legal tool, but they have very real kind of operational impacts. So you have to kind of connect all of the above.
Absolutely. And we work with all of those different types of corporate functions that control risks. But where I have seen quite a significant change in the tone and role of particular teams over the past few years, largely as a result of what's happened with Ukraine and Russia, is that legal and compliance folks who understand politics, their voice and influence in their organizations has really increased.
So I want to get at some of these changes, and we've kind of alluded a few times to to the idea that things have shifted in recent years. And you brought up this point about the friction between the kind of commercial goals of an organization and the political imperatives of a government, and then those two things can come into conflict. So we first met maybe 9-10 years ago, and at the time, multinational companies were trying to figure out how they could potentially work in Iran, which had been a sanctioned market, but with the adoption of the nuclear deal was going to benefit from the lifting of U.S. secondary sanctions. And that was the time when I was first learning what exactly a company like Control Risks does and what your job entailed. And basically, I had come to understand that CEOs at global companies were looking for big opportunities, and those opportunities were often in high-risk jurisdictions. And it might be because of sanctions risk. It might be because of corruption in that market that they were interested in. It might even be because of physical threats to the security of staff that needed to be taken into consideration. But it seemed like the idea was that those were manageable risks, and there was a big reward at the other end if you could manage them. and that your job and the job of your colleagues at Control Risks, among other companies in this space, was to basically come up with a way to make sure that you could mitigate the risk to get the reward. Is that a fair description of how things have generally been, or at least were back in the day when we first met?
I think that's a very eloquent description of how I see our role with our clients. I've worked at Control Risks for over 13 years now, and it's always been apparent to me that our role is really to enable our clients to take risk. We help with the assessment and calibration of the issues that our clients are facing, and we find ways in which our clients can practically, legally, ethically, and in a way that's resourceful to manage those issues. We don't try and find ways to stop people from doing things.
But at the same time, it does seem like that friction between what the companies want to do and the political kind of environment is increasing. And recently, Control Risks published a biennial report called the Navigating the Global Sanctions Landscape report. And the last report came out at the beginning of 2022. So it didn't really take into account kind of the sanctions that were just then starting to be imposed on Russia and, of course, the fallout of those measures. When you look at the report that just recently came out and you compare it to the report of 2 years ago, I mean, what are the most significant changes in the global sanctions landscape that CEOs are having to deal with?
I'm really pleased that you mentioned that report, because I'm very pleased you mentioned that report, Asfandyar, because a number of my excellent colleagues who live and breathe these issues contributed to it, as did several external lawyers and academics that we work with. And if I look back on the type of issues that we were talking about in that report and the types of ways in which we have been working with our clients, I think there are probably three things that really stand out to me as priority issues for most global CEOs at the moment to be thinking about. One is the myriad ways in which companies from the G7 are bumping up against a Russia nexus outside of Russia. And that's because of the ways in which Russia's role in the global economy have evolved in the past 20 years as a major exporter of energy and other commodities, but also the role of Russian money and wealth in different corners of the globe. And we know that a lot of senior executives are very worried about this inadvertent exposure to Russia, which they find themselves coming up against in different ways, because there are quite significant regulatory and reputational consequences to that. The second point is an interesting one from a geopolitical, geoeconomics perspective, and that is that governments that are either already exposed to significant sanctions regimes from G7 economies, albeit not always all of them, such as Russia, Iran, and then the countries that have tended to align economically with them over the past couple of years in opposition to the G7, most notably China, they are creating alternative ways of doing business and alternative ways of moving goods and services and money separately to the mechanisms that have typically been overseen by G7 economies. And it's beginning to create increasing bifurcation, I think, in the global economy, where you have different structures and processes for doing different types of business. And that is inherently driven by sanctions, I believe. And then the third area that I think senior leaders are thinking about at the moment is the increased resourcing of enforcement action. The enforcement of sanctions has typically been the domain of the US government because of the resourcing that it's had at its disposal. That's most notably over the years been felt by banks, but also by corporates as well. We are seeing in 2024 more money, more people in Europe focused on this topic. And if you speak to legal practitioners, you speak to people in government, it's clearly a focus area. And once we see more significant enforcement action, particularly in the UK and the EU, I think, again, this issue is going to jump up to executive and board level conversations. How confident are we that we don't have something similar coming our way?
So I think that's a really kind of helpful way of describing the shift, because it points to this idea that, and this is something that we discussed in a previous episode of the podcast with Maria Shagina and Daniel McDowell, the idea that these risks are becoming systemic in a way that they weren't before. So CEOs looking at the sanctions landscape used to just have to think about, well, we won't work in this country, or this country. But now it seems like the risk is a little bit different, and it is like it may be the case that you don't actually work in a sanctioned economy, but because of kind of the ripple effects of measures taken against that economy, you have impacts on your operations that you need to take into account.
I think that's right. And it's also because the way in which sanctions have been imposed has innovated, because they've had to be sensitive to the second and third order economic consequences of placing restrictions on an economy as significant as Russia's, right? You can't just do a binary on-off, Russia has access to the G7, Russia doesn't have access to the G7, without causing very significant economic harm. So it has been something that has been scaled over time, rather than binary in the way that, say, designations against perhaps Cuba were once upon a time.
Mm-hmm. So when we hear CEOs talking about sanctions, obviously they are having to sort of adjust in light of this new landscape that we've just described. One of the things that we often are hearing about is the simple fact that they do have to scale back or wind down operations in certain markets, as was the case in Iran in 2018 and Russia in 2022. But we're also hearing more about the idea that companies are engaged in a process of de-risking, meaning that they're trying to lower their exposure generally to markets where there could be sanctions risks, as export control risks, or trying to understand where the systemic risks might arise for them and adjust accordingly. So what goes into the decision for a CEO to wind down operations or scale back or change how they interact with the global economy in light of these risks? And what are the trigger points for CEOs to give up on big market opportunities?
The period has been since late 2021, when it became more apparent that Russia was considering a more fulsome invasion of Ukraine. And in both of those periods, we at Control Risk will have worked with in excess of probably 200, 250 companies thinking about what they needed to do. And it's very difficult to distill one approach to thinking about how you de-risk or exit a market, because for the reasons I explained earlier about size, geographical complexity, sector, the considerations are different from organization to organization. And one thing that has also been quite apparent to me in those discussions is that also the politics of the senior leadership of an organization have an influence. And what I mean by that is that some senior leaders take an ideological position of, well, I will continue to do business until it is illegal and I risk some sort of penalty. Whereas others will take an ethical position based on what else is happening around them, which could be linked to sanctions. So I have heard senior leaders say, with respect to Russia, we are staying in Russia until we have to leave. And I have heard other senior leaders say about Russia, we are leaving Russia as a political statement linked to the invasion of Ukraine. To your question about trigger points, this is a really interesting one, because there are tools that organizations can use to help think through the trigger points that might necessitate them leaving or de-risking in some way. And I think the tool that we recommend using the most at Control Risks is working through a proper scenario-based assessment of your business, looking ahead at how politics will evolve, what that means for the regulatory and sanctions environment, what it means for your reputational and ethical considerations as a business. And I think importantly also the legal and practical fallout of all of those conditions. And so we work with clients around their Russia business to do exactly that from late 2021. And when you build those scenarios, you can then work backwards to identify trigger points that would necessitate you leaving or scaling back. And in some cases, it's a phased decision where you calibrate based on what happens politically. So in one case with a European client, I recall it was really the major trigger point for them was, well, we will leave when our banking partners tell us we need to. In another case with a US client, it was, well, we will leave when Russia advances beyond the territory that it held in eastern Ukraine up until February 2022. So again, always a little bit different and always, I think, calibrated by a range of different considerations. However, regardless of what the trigger points are, I think going through the exercise where you as an organization know what your trigger points are and you know what you then need to do. You have a playbook for your exit. So you're not scrambling around trying to figure out like precisely what your exposure is to different Russian counterparties or which Russian banks you're paying your employees' salaries into. All these sort of second and third order complications that everyone had to live through. You can build a playbook for that now, I think, which you would apply in other markets.
I think the conversation we've had so far makes it sound like, for the most part, CEOs are being coerced or forced to take certain decisions because of this friction between what governments want to achieve as part of their foreign policy goals and what typically had been the motives of large companies, which is basically to make a profit wherever they can. But looking at it, I think more fairly, there are ways in which governments are trying to change the calculus around risk and reward. So it's not only that CEOs are having to think about risk and give up the reward. And here I want to sort of talk a little bit about the idea that we have, for example, a foreign policy priority or an economic policy priority in governments in Europe and the US around reshoring or friendshoring, which is to say that there are incentives being created to help multinational companies change how they sort of interact with the global economy. And in that way, it almost seems like the risk-reward scenario has been inverted, that now reducing risk, if you're a global CEO, may be the way to get the biggest rewards because you have on tap incentives like financing and grants that are available to you to move production or retool supply chains altogether. Is that something that you see as having fundamentally changed? And are we in a moment now where the idea that going into high-risk jurisdictions means bigger rewards is no longer the case, and actually the bigger rewards may be in what have been typically low-risk jurisdictions?
It's a really interesting perspective. I am a little cautious about taking the view that the influence of politics or geopolitics on businesses has fundamentally changed. And I think that's because ultimately, as a business leader, you have always faced changes in political leaders, changes in political preferences, changes in policy and regulation that have either created opportunities for you in the markets that you're already in or elsewhere in the world, or have changed your calculus of risk. And so all the examples that you've just provided, I think we could probably find examples of further back in human history in different forms. So I'm a little reluctant to think that that equation between politics and business has changed. What I feel has changed quite fundamentally in the past few years, because of the diet of political crises, and you can include the responses to COVID in that, business leaders need to be, and are expected to be, more conversant in different aspects of politics. And to claim that your business is apolitical or you don't take a political stance, I think can be perceived in some quarters as being naive now. So as a senior leader, when you're interfacing with all sorts of different stakeholders, being literate in geopolitics and the impact of geopolitics on your business is hugely important now.
I'd like to sort of go into how that's filtering into the actual decision-making of businesses. And we can go back to kind of the case that you've been dealing with a lot, which is what should large companies do with regards to their operations in Russia? There's a new report that's been recently published by the Kiev School of Economics, and they collected data on what have foreign companies actually done in response to the Russia sanctions. And interestingly, they find that although 300 foreign companies have fully withdrawn from the Russian market, 1,500 companies are still maintaining what they describe as usual operations in Russia. And for me, that was a bit surprising because we tend to think that the sanctions came in and it was a, let's say, either legal obligation or an ethical obligation for companies to withdraw. But it sounds like a lot of companies found a way to stay because they wanted to, or had to stay because there was no way to exit. How do we explain the variation between the companies that did pull out and the companies that remain, and what factors into the decision making there?
There's been lots of really good research done on this topic, and people have used a variety of data sources to inform that. Our work at Control Risk is a little bit more qualitative and quantitative, I would say, because it's based on the cases that we see in front of us with clients that we're working with. And everything that you pointed to in terms of some companies made a decision that they wanted to stay, some made a decision to leave but then couldn't, some made the decision to leave and then could partially leave, some didn't really decide anything and then had the decision made for them, either because of sanctions or because of actions by the Russian government. So there are a whole range of case studies that you can pull out. However, I think ultimately it is something that, again, that comes down to the politics of the senior leadership of an organization. Some people will take a very clear position that they will remain in Russia until they are forced to leave legally because they want to continue to employ people and pay their staff in the way that they've done for several decades.
So that's a different, almost ethical obligation that they're considering.
Yeah. Exactly. It's, I think in these very high stress, high stakes situations, we need to remember that there are multiple perspectives on these issues. And as an organization like Control Risk, I think I at least see my role as an advisor to be to raise these issues to our clients rather than to tell them precisely what it is that they should do, because that is their decision, right? They have their own frameworks and values that they're working towards. Our role is to highlight the different courses of action and the different types of response you would get from different stakeholders. So, for instance, for these companies that are staying in Russia because they think they can or they should, or because they can't get out, there are numerous consequences around their exposure in other markets, their ability to do business in other markets, and the reputational response of different stakeholders. And you need to be thinking about those things holistically when you make a decision.
The idea that, companies might want to stay, but then decide that they ultimately have to leave. I mean, within that is also this idea that at some point, there is a future where the sanctions may no longer be in place and where it may be possible to return to a market. And presumably, that is meant to be one of the goals of the foreign policy decision makers as well, that a lot of these disruptions are supposed to be temporary, and in the pursuit of diplomacy, an opportunity should emerge where maybe we can reintegrate countries like Iran and Russia into the global economy. Now, companies see that scenario in the future, and presumably they would want to be prepared for it, even in an instance in which they have made a decision to leave from a market like Russia or Iran. One thing I've heard when it comes to Iran is that companies do actually take steps to leave, keep their foot in the door. And one way they might do that is that, for example, they will sell their shares. The Western company will sell its shares in a joint venture partnership that it had in a country like Iran to its local partner. But they will do that with the stipulation that at some point in the future, when it's possible legally or sensible politically or worthwhile commercially, they can buy back their shares at an advantageous price. Is that a structure that you've seen in other cases? And do you feel that CEOs are trying to, while they're making in the short term very tough decisions about winding down or fully withdrawing from a market, are they taking steps to keep their foot in the door for the future?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen that with a number of clients in Iran over the past 5 to 10 years, where the attractiveness of the market, its longer term potential, has meant that they've wished to leave something in place that puts them on the front foot for when those conditions that you described about the regulatory environment being right, the political environment being right, and the commercial attractiveness of that given country being right. And we've seen it in other cases as well. Some organizations have done that with Russia. We've seen it with countries that have had very significant security issues, such as Yemen, where organizations have had to leave and have wanted to exit in a way that's relatively clean and sensible for their shareholders and their employees, but have a longer term view on their ability to return. So not solely something that's driven by sanctions. But you made a very interesting comment at the outset of that question, which was sanctions are there to try and change and nudge behavior of the governments or individuals or groups that you're imposing them on. And I'm sure you've covered this in other discussions with the experts that you've been speaking to. But unfortunately, there are very few cases now where we've seen that work successfully. And in many cases, I think, particularly with governments, you end up almost with a slow decline, or decline may be the wrong word there, but additional sanctions around the edges and a clear direction of travel, which is very, very difficult to unpick. We saw a window of it around the JCPOA with Iran, which, as you know better than most, changed when we had a change in government in the US. And it's difficult, I think, at the moment to look at any of the major sanctions regimes and see one where that change in fortune, that change in the tide is likely.
I think that takes us to sort of the next couple questions, which is really about the dialogue between the policymakers and the CEOs. And, you know, we've talked a lot about this idea that the policymakers are setting goals and then the CEOs have to adjust to those goals, but it's a bit of a two-way street. I mean, first, let's understand a little bit more about how exactly CEOs are getting the message from government leaders. You know, we've talked about the idea that there are these foreign policy goals. The new Control Risks report on navigating the sanctions landscape talks specifically about how there's a new effort underway among American and European regulators to improve the implementation and enforcement of the sanctions, which means putting more pressure on CEOs to do certain things. How exactly do they put that pressure on CEOs? Are they writing letters? Are they picking up the phone? Are they issuing vague threats through press releases and media appearances? How do the political leaders get their point across to the business leaders?
There are several ways in which that happens. And I think if you start with the institutions of government that are responsible for sanctions, I think their view will be that it's not threats, so to speak, it's guidance and interpretation and FAQs that they issue to highlight where risk is and what expected behavior to manage that should be. You see, particularly with Russia, and I think recently since the war in Gaza, a lot of guidance focused on those two sanctions regimes. And in the US in particular, cooperation between organizations like the Office for Foreign Asset Control, like the Department of Commerce, like Department of Justice, where they are coming together and sharing information about the typologies that they see around sanctions evasion and what good looks like. And for senior leaders in businesses, but also people in the minutiae of risk assessments and due diligence and compliance within these organizations, these are really useful guidance notes. There is also an element of threat and warning in them. And I think then when you hear people speaking from government at conferences around these issues, they are there to make very clear political statements around the trajectory of these regimes and the enforcement of these regimes. So there is definitely a threat and warning element to it. The other ways in which this is happening, and from what I've been told, this has increased dramatically around Russia, is governments essentially fishing for information from the private sector. So issuing requests for information rather than a formal subpoena to see what organizations come back with about their exposure to Russia or their interaction with various governments in the Middle East. And I think what's happening there is essentially governments trying to find ways to increase the ways that they can harvest intelligence and harvest information so that they can look at potential additional designation actions or enforcement actions against the private sector. And that's a trend that I think will probably continue in the US and probably increase in Europe as more resources and people are focused on these topics.
The idea that, governments are getting more effective at coordinating internally, getting their messages across, I think that's very, very clear. But I'm also interested in how business leaders are putting pressure on government leaders to help them kind of set their goals or to try and express how they think that some of these issues should play out. And I'm thinking back to 2018 when it was increasingly clear that Donald Trump was going to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. And at the World Economic Forum in Davos, there was a dinner where Trump was going to dine with a bunch of European CEOs. And one of those CEOs was Patrick Pouyanné from Total, the French oil giant, which had big interests in Iran. And Patrick used the opportunity of the dinner to try and ask Donald Trump, or basically tell Donald Trump, look, I don't think you should withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Why don't we give the deal a little bit more time to prove itself? In parallel, Total had opened a lobbying office for a short period in Washington to try and get some messages across to key government stakeholders to say, look, this is what we're doing in the market, and this is why we think, we should be able to continue operating. Obviously, Trump didn't listen. And so the question is whether CEOs can be effective in trying to communicate their points across about where their commercial imperatives should meet up with the political goals of different governments. Is there any kind of effective lobby in place around these issues?
That question goes to the point about the relationship between politics and business, which we discussed a few questions back. Business leaders wouldn't have been able to stand together to prevent the general direction of the measures against Russia in the past 2 years, but they have been able to influence the detail and timing of some of those measures, and they've been able to provide feedback about the second and third order consequences of some of these measures, which has allowed governments to calibrate how they've imposed sanctions, not whether they will impose sanctions. So a business lobby, I don't think, can stand in the way of what are very sensitive, geopolitically significant foreign policy decisions. And that goes back to the very outset of this conversation, I think, where the disconnect sometimes between the business world and the world of sanctions politics is that they get seen as business regulation in the way that maybe corruption regulation could be seen, but they are fundamentally about politics. And business leaders need to keep that front and center when they're trying to engage with any government authority about this topic.
I want to end by turning to China and actually picking up on the point you just raised that business leaders aren't going to be able to change the strategy of government when it comes to these big political issues, but they may have some influence over the tactics that are used by those governments in trying to meet their political goals. And when it comes to China, we're sort of dealing with this strategic question of growing economic competition between the US and China. And we can see CEOs kind of trying to make their voices heard over some of the tactics there. And one example is that Carlos Tavares, who's the CEO of Stellantis, the European-American automaker, has recently criticized the Biden administration's 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs and has described them as basically misguided protectionism. How worried are CEOs that China is going to be increasingly subject to tariffs, export controls, and maybe even sanctions? And when you speak to CEOs today about their China operations, are you having conversations about these sort of tactical issues of how they can potentially try and deal with political scenarios and maybe have influence over how this plays out? And also, what are you advising them when it comes to the possible medium-term risks for their operations, considering that every multinational company in the world is fundamentally linked to China in some way?
It's a great question. And I think a series of questions that if a global multinationals leadership team isn't thinking through these questions, then they need to be. And I don't say that on the premise that I think that we will inevitably go in a direction of a more visceral or unpleasant conflict between China and the US. But to the earlier advice around scenario planning, as a leader of a global business, you need to be thinking about the myriad different ways in which that relationship could evolve and how other countries will position themselves in that relationship. That could give you friendshoring opportunities somewhere else in the world. It could mean that you pivot certain aspects of your supply chain so you have redundancy elsewhere or alternative routes to bring goods to different markets. So that planning exercise needs to be there. But also China is going to remain a fundamentally vital part of the global economy. So you also need to have your strategy for China, provided that you are the type of business that is able to do business in China. And that's a decision for the Chinese government as much as it is for foreign governments thinking about their relationship there.
So it sounds like we're going to hear more from global CEOs in trying to shape the parameters of this potential economic conflict. As they go through the scenario planning, they'll come to understand what might be important for them as possible trigger points, as things that really fundamentally change the way that they can operate, and that they might want to get their voices heard in the halls of government to say, look, we understand why you're considering these measures, but let's maybe carve out some space so that we can continue to operate the way we do.
I think those conversations are happening and they inevitably will continue to do so. One thing I would say about senior business leaders thinking about China is that a lot of good habits have been learned, I think, in recent years about how companies think about political risk and how they apply that to their strategy. So if we're talking about one of the paradigm relationships that are going to shape geopolitics and shape economics over the next decade and beyond, then you need to be applying those tools to that relationship if you're planning your business well and you're managing risk well.
Henry, we've reached the end of our time, which means I need to ask you the final question I ask every guest on the show. When did you realize that sanctions were changing the world?
So my example, I'm not sure, is one in which sanctions changed the world, but certainly shows how sanctions have materially affected people's lives. And that was when I moved to the UAE in 2014 with Control Risk, primarily to work on Iran-related issues then. And I met Iranians living in the UAE who would give me their examples of being unable to travel, being unable to go to the universities that they'd been offered places at because they physically couldn't get to the country or pay money for their tuition, or in various countries in the world were unable to open bank accounts. And this, to me, was really quite a telling example of how these big picture geopolitical issues that we think about and talk about and read about trickle down into affecting normal people's ability to live their lives in the way that they want. And that, I think, that connection can sometimes get lost when we're talking about these things, but it's really, really important.
And it's a connection that's inherent to everything we've talked about today, because ultimately the decisions made by multinational companies directly filter into the lives of ordinary people in terms of whether they are employed, whether they have goods and services. So I think it's a really important point to end on, that all of this does trickle down.
And some of the people who do really important work in this space, I think, are people who really work hard with government to find ways to keep humanitarian services working in countries that are really in dire straits, and also to get the money moving to be able to allow that humanitarian service to continue as well.
We'll be covering that in a forthcoming episode of
Excellent.
The Sanctions Age. Henry, thank you for a fantastic conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm Esfander Batmagelic, and this has been The Sanctions Age. Our show is produced by Spiritland Productions and is supported by a grant from the Halling Center for International Dialogue. Thanks for listening.